Everybody, Nancy Snyderman, your moderator, and with what I understand, the stewards of everything that's going to happen in technology, medicine, biotech, and pharma in the next 3 to 6 years. I would like to remind you that there is an app, yorn.com, that you can all log on. I know you've already seen that you can get to it. You can not only put in your comments, but also if you have questions, put them in. They'll be selected and sent to me. I have my iPad right here, so we'll see how hip we are. So send me your questions, and you can pick the brains of of my mighty six. I'd like to start with Peter Slavin at my far right and ask all of my panelists to please self-introduce and explain who they are. Peter?
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Slavin. I'm the president of Mass General Hospital, and welcome to Boston, and congratulations to Chris and his colleagues for pulling this conference together.
I'm George Scangos, CEO of Biogen.
Hi, I'm Betsy Nabel, president of Brigham Women's Hospital, and also want to welcome you here and congratulate Chris Colbert and Ann Klebansky for putting the conference together. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Mahoney with Boston Scientific. I'm the CEO. And we weren't described as the hottest company. It was the biotech companies. So,
oh, I thought that was you were the hottest.
No, definitely not me.
I got it all wrong.
But we're going to have to work on this growth rate to be termed the hottest company. But thank you for letting us be here.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Leiden. I'm CEO of Vertex, and it's a pleasure to be here with a lot of old friends and colleagues this afternoon.
It's an exciting panel. John LaPook started off this morning talking about disruption, and I think the aim of this panel is to take that disruption, which we all believe is not necessarily helpful if we look across how do we move forward. So while we might be internally disruptive within our own companies, I think the challenge now is to how we drive collaboration and innovation in almost a horizontal way. So I want to start off by that because I fear that tonight on all the broadcasts, if you read for today's front page of the Wall Street Journal, it is going to be that a pharmaceutical company just bought up 2 old drugs, Nitropress and Isoprel, which are old standards, and in one day, the price of the drugs went up 522% and 175% because there's no competition. It broad brushes pharma in a not flattering way. And yet we have to talk about drug discovery, innovation, compensation, and well, I'm going to put the shareholders aside because I don't think they're as important. I want to say what we owe patients should be sort of the driving force. So let me start off with you, George, because you have an interesting position right now as someone who will be heading up pharma. And you have a foot in both worlds. How do we take the challenges of drug development, move them forward, and explain the intricacies to the American public?
If we had an easy question to that, an easy answer to that. Look, it's a challenging problem. The exciting thing right now is there are a lot of exciting new drugs coming forward from companies throughout the industry. The science has matured. Understanding of disease processes has matured. So if we look out into the future, there will be drugs that treat diseases that are not well treated or treated at all.
Sovaldi is a perfect example.
Yes, and Sovaldi got a lot of grief for its price, right? But Sovaldi's a cure for hepatitis C. It cures hepatitis C. Those are patients who aren't going to get cirrhosis or need liver transplants or get liver cancer. It's a remarkable drug. So let's keep that in perspective. And it's a particularly interesting example because I think a lot of the furor over Sovaldi was the way it was introduced. I think Gilead, which makes Sovaldi, did a great job of bringing the drug forward. They did not do a good job of introducing it, and it caught state Medicare agencies, Medicaid, agencies by surprise. They hadn't budgeted for it. There are a huge bolus of patients who need it, and it was introduced into a system that wasn't prepared for it. So I think as we go forward, we have to be more thoughtful about how we bring innovations and how we price them and how we get people ready for them so that they don't cause that. And we're going to have to find ways to save money to pay for them because we can't increase budgets forever.
You know, to build on that, George, I think you're absolutely right. Sovaldi, we hope, will be a case study of how not to collaborate around pricing and communication. For Peter and I as providers, we had already formulated our yearly budget, and then the Sovaldi pricing came out. We had many of our patients, since we're an series of academic medical centers that we needed to treat, and yet we simply weren't prepared. We hadn't budgeted. And we also had to deal with the Massachusetts state funding of Medicaid patients. It wasn't adequately budgeted as well.
You know, Nancy, I want to come back to something you said at the beginning, which is how do we tell the story? And I would say there's one thing we haven't done a very good job of as a community and certainly as an industry, it's telling the story. And I totally agree with George about what's coming, but even when I look backward to the time when I was a medical student and ask, how are some of these common diseases treated, and what has this industry in collaboration with academia done for the treatment of those diseases? You know, I'm a cardiologist. When I was a medical student, if you had a heart attack, and Betsy will remember this well, you got admitted to a private room on a floor at the University of Chicago where I was a medical student, and we basically watched you for 3 weeks, waiting for the complications of having that heart attack, heart failure, arrhythmias, et cetera. And often we rounded on patients and found them dead in bed. If you have a heart attack today, I hope none of you do, here in Boston, you'll go over to the Brigham or the General, you'll go straight to the cath lab, you'll likely have a stent put in place, you may have a defibrillator put in place, you'll be put on beta blockers and aspirin and anticoagulants. We've cut the mortality in half, and you'll likely go home 3 or 4 days later with preserved cardiac function. That's a great story. That's what we want to do in all these diseases. And by the way, that's not unique. It's happened in GI bleeding. It's happened in measles, where we had 3 to 4 million cases a year, reduced to 86 with a vaccine. So I think we need to tell the story of the value of what we do as a group in life sciences, because that's the inspiration for what we're going to do in the future.
As 3 CEO heads and 2 provider heads, it seems to have been a divisive wedge put between the guys who make stuff, the universities who admit patients, some of whom can pay and some who can't, and you cannot talk to each other nor collaborate because you can't really trust each other. Bad, broken model. How does collaboration work now for all of you?
Well, I would say that, I mean, there are 2 areas where we need to collaborate. One is on the research side, which is a long-standing set of collaborations, and certainly Betsy and I and the Brigham and the MGH are blessed being here in Boston and having so many biotech companies, research pharma, device companies here to collaborate with. But increasingly, we need to figure out a way to collaborate on the financing of the delivery of healthcare, because even if Gilead had given us more notice about this new wonderful $86,000 a year drug, it still would put enormous pressure on us as providers who are at risk for hundreds of thousands of patients and have incentives to try to moderate the rise in healthcare costs. So somehow we need to, we're moving away for providers from the fee-for-service reimbursement system. Somehow we need the supply industry, drugs, devices, to move away from the fee-for-service system as well. And as far as I can tell, there are not great models of that yet that have emerged.
I was going to comment on that, and just on the transition from fee-for-service to more of a population management. You know, it's a big step for both suppliers and also for the hospital systems, because many of the hospital systems today are still paid in a fee-for-service model and transitioning, but also for, you know, the supplier side. And so not just Boston Scientific, but other companies, you're seeing us focus more on becoming category leaders. So when hospitals consolidate, we can offer broad-based solutions. And also with
Drill
that—
down on that for me for a second. I mean, specifically give me some examples of what does that mean?
Well, take, you know, you discuss interventional cardiology. And so, you know, we think as hospitals continue to consolidate, besides drug-eluting stents and pacemakers and defibrillators and guide wires, you have to get into heart failure diagnostics, pre-screening, potentially LVADs, to create a wide continuum of products.
Is there any part of the vascular system you don't want to own?
Don't want to treat.
Where's that question?
I'll stick with own.
So we really want to be the category leader there. And the second point, I'm going to dodge that one. The second piece is the services with it. And so we're helping hospitals try to be efficient with the inventory management, with the productivity of the departments, potentially with their billing. And then thirdly, because if you're a category leader that way, then you can have those different payment models that were discussed, where you could maybe do it per member per month charge or based on a population. So it's an evolution, but I think a lot of companies are starting to lean forward that way.
I think we need to think more creatively how we as providers interface and collaborate with our device and pharma leaders. As Mike was just alluding to, device companies are now in many ways becoming healthcare solutions companies, whether it be in the cath lab, the OR, or some of the procedural areas. And I think there's such a great mix of hospitals and systems across this country that moving from fee-for-service to global payment is very complicated. We may have pretty good capability of doing it here between our Mass General and the Brigham, but there are many hospital systems that are much smaller for which this is really going to be a major leap. And so having the device industry or the pharma industry take on these broader healthcare solutions as offerings, I think is a great way to think about collaboration.
Nancy, I think this is a broader question
And
than
that's right,
just the
George.
healthcare system.
Go ahead.
Right? This is a societal question. If you look at total healthcare costs, it's a very complex system with hospitals and providers and, of course, pharmaceutical companies and device makers. But we aren't addressing a lot of the really tough societal questions that we're going to need to address if we're going to get the cost of healthcare down. Because it's easy to say, well, let's just decrease the price of drugs or devices or hospitals. But if you look at it, you know, drugs are 9% of the whole healthcare system, proprietary drugs 6%. If you took them away, you'd move the system back 3 years in budget and they'd start growing again. That's not a simple answer. And that doesn't say that drug prices shouldn't come down or should. It's just that's not the solution to a very complicated problem. And so we need to ask questions like, if a quarter of all healthcare spending is spent on the last 6 months of life, which it is, if most people die in the hospital or in the ICU, is that something that we as a society, is that where we want to spend a quarter of our healthcare dollars? Or do we want to spend it on new innovative treatments that cure hepatitis C, or hopefully from George that are going to cure Alzheimer's disease soon? We're going to have those tough decisions to make, and we aren't going to be able to make them without really addressing these top-line levels questions as a society.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make just a variation on that point. I agree with everything Jeff just said. But look, the payers, so the government, insurance companies, employers, whoever ultimately pays the bill for health care, obviously want to contain the cost and, if possible, keep it from growing. Everybody else in the system has a business to run, right? You guys have to worry about the top line of the hospitals. We're all public companies. We have shareholders who expect us to make a profit. Everybody can't increase their revenues indefinitely while we maintain healthcare costs. Right? And so something has to give. And what has to give is there's efficiency that can be gotten out of the system for sure.
Does that mean there should be centers of excellence for things like liver transplants, heart transplants, and not every hospital in the country should be able to do some procedures?
I think that's one way to think about things, sure. That, you know, how many bone marrow transplant centers should there be in a particular geography? I don't know the answer, but probably the answer is less than there are, right? And so you could save some money that way. You know, I think there's going to have to be some responsibility for drug pricing. But the answer is not containing unit costs. There's only so much that we're going to save with that. I think we have to think about gaining efficiencies. We have to think about preventive care, which is cheaper. High deductible health plans, which discourage people from going to get a checkup, for example, are exactly
So you just
wrong.
hit on something. I'm going to let Peter answer this. This came from the audience. Question, are we moving to a system of health care where the disparities of care are becoming even more pronounced?
Well, I hope we're moving to a system where they're becoming less pronounced. Right now, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, 9 in 10 Americans have health insurance, and hopefully those trends will continue. And lack of access to health insurance is one of the biggest sources of disparities in the healthcare system. I also hope as we move increasingly digitize our healthcare system, that it'll be harder for people to fall through the cracks and not get the care that they need, because we'll have more reliable systems in place to make sure that people get the care they need. So I'm an eternal optimist. I hope that given where healthcare is going, that the system will decrease disparities rather than increase them.
Another question from the audience. The idea of telling better success stories, and you have an interesting one coming up with a cystic fibrosis drug, but will that be enough to allow the development of therapies that have the potential to cure disorders like Sovaldi, and include gene therapies that may be sort of simple treatment drugs? I mean, we were talking backstage that in our lifetime we've seen certain illnesses like acute lymphocytic leukemia in children cured. Young adults now with cystic fibrosis, where the pediatricians don't want to let go of their population base because they've developed this phenomenal bond. What are the illnesses that are out there that you're looking at? And let's dip into neurodegenerative for a second, where you think there's a race to the cure, or at least identify patients and some drug or medical device that can preempt illness progression.
Hemophilia is a great example of that.
Hemophilia.
Right? And so we have 2 drugs on the market to treat hemophilia. There are some early, very positive results for certain gene therapy vectors that have made, small numbers of patients still. So, the jury's still out to some extent, but it looks fairly promising that these kids are now, or these people are now free of transfusions for long periods of time. So, especially for hemophilia B, which is technically easier, I don't think it's that many years before gene therapy is an approved way to treat those patients.
Some of the T-cell therapies in cancer using these genetically engineered T-cells, CAR T-cells,
Yep.
look phenomenal. Still small numbers of patients, mostly the liquid tumors, the blood tumors, but that is going to be a force to be reckoned with, and it looks like it's going to be curative in a significant number of patients.
At what point are regulators going to relax a little bit and recognize that you don't have to have 20,000 people in a study to show effectiveness of something and you can move forward?
I mean, I think in fairness, we've had a very good relationship with regulators around the CF programs, in which many of the clinical trials are just a couple hundred patients. So I think when there's a severe disease that doesn't have any therapy, and you can actually provide a transformative therapy, a curative or modifying therapy, I think regulators have been pretty open to being quite flexible in terms of getting those treatments to patients.
How about in the medical device
We've
world?
seen some, well, the trial demands are certainly there because the clinical efficacy of the devices that we sell and implant. And where we have seen some improvement recently in regulatory is just approval time. Productivity has become better, especially with 510K approvals. And we're also seeing the FDA really for the first time take on first-in-human use. And so there's a lot of activity now in mitral valve replacement and mitral valve repair. And we're doing first-in-human studies in the U.S., many companies. But maybe back to your first question, we're not a drug company, but we do a number of new things and also look in some future. One is just treat patients with severe pain. And as you're seeing devices become more miniaturized and also in deep brain stimulation with Parkinson's, with better visualization, smaller devices, just better specificity, we're confident that hopefully medical devices will become more paramount in the neurospace as well.
There are 2 areas that we're looking at, perhaps from the research side. One, as immunotherapies proceed in cancer, there's going to be tremendous crossover into the neurosciences. And so for MS and some of the other chronic neurological degenerative diseases that have an inflammatory component, we're hoping that will help. The other is that the gene editing technique, the CRISPR-Cas system, is now very, very promising, and I think will really be a boost to the gene therapy field, which has had a very protracted history and is now beginning to see some success. But what Nancy, it's really like the history of medical research, that there's a field that develops and then suddenly there'll be a major advance, either in a technology or scientific breakthrough that really takes the field forward.
How many of you have had your genome done?
Partial.
How many in the audience have had their genomes done? I know Chris has. Interesting. I thought it would be more. I really thought more hands would go up. It's interesting because when you look at the democratization of the genome to the point that companies like 23andMe are at least pushing out, patients can now sign up for certain clinical trials, and suddenly, boom, you have people who are interested in your company, your research. And it seems to me a really wonderful way to move the needle forward. That was a bad metaphor. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Nancy, that's really one of the challenges that we face around precision medicine, and trying to get a handle about, as physicians and supporters of medical research, what could we do to help really aid our patients in getting very targeted or focused therapies.
It has not been lost on the audience that the word world is in the title of this conference, and we can't remain just US-centric. How do other markets compare to ours? What are the challenges in Europe, and what are the areas of moving forward more quickly, perhaps, than in the United States? I'll start with you. Yeah.
Sure. Well, in Europe, we typically see in the device world, especially for PMA products, these products are approved in Europe many times 3 to 5 years before the U.S. And so, with that, there's a lot of benefits from a company standpoint, also for the patients in Europe. You're getting, earlier feasibility studies, you're getting quicker product approvals, and then we typically take that and get approval in the U.S. and Japan and so forth. So, from that standpoint, it's great for innovation, for venture capital, for private equity money into the European landscape. It's tougher in the U.S. Given the clinical trial and some of the delays. And so we've seen a lot of the investment move over to Europe. But as a global company, half our sales are outside the U.S. We're seeing a lot of innovation start there and then pushed elsewhere.
George?
Yeah, look, from a drug perspective, Europe is challenging. The approval process is okay. It works pretty well. But you can't actually sell the drug until you agree with the government of each European country on what the price will be in that thing. And that can take a year, 18 months after approval. And since they have a monopsonistic system, there's one buyer, right? And they hold all the cards, right? And so they've, Germany, the UK, other countries now have instituted what they call health technology assessment. So ostensibly rational ways to determine what a drug is actually worth. And they work with various degrees of objectivism and objectivity, I guess, and effectiveness. And so they are, in some cases, just a procedure to get the prices down. The challenge is, if the US paid the same price, then that would stem the flow of new drugs, because it would put such a severe drag on the profitability of the industry. Everybody would be cutting costs, cutting projects, cutting R&D. So the US is actually supporting the world.
I think that's a really important point, because
That's a major statement.
you can see the effects in Europe, right? Very much different from what Mike is talking about. There are very few biotech companies in Europe, much less VC investment, much less innovation coming out of Europe because of the pricing and reimbursement system that George is talking about. The US is subsidizing the rest of the world, and if we bring the same sort of system to the US, I think it's going to have the same effects.
Peter, I'm going to give this one to you. This is from the audience. How about teaching doctors and patients that the answer is not always a pill? Physicians will tell you they write prescriptions because patients always want action. How do we start to talk about lifestyle changes? And I'm always amazed when I come to medical conferences that no one's fat. I mean, it's like we're talking, people who are already taking care of themselves, they're already eating well, they're worried about their brains, they want to slide out at home plate at maybe 100. But how do we take that and then sort of wrap it into the healthcare disparities from before? And really, we have become a culture of fix it, not prevent it. Mm-hmm. So how, as someone who runs an extraordinary institution, do you start to instill that in your young trainees?
I mean, it's definitely an evolutionary process. There are some patients who, when they go to see the doctor for colds, sinus infections, don't feel like they're getting what they need unless they walk out with prescriptions. And certainly from the physician standpoint, it's a lot easier to write a prescription than to spend the time explaining to somebody why antibiotics aren't really that helpful in most cases of sinusitis. So clearly we need to evolve the educational system. I'm still concerned that in most of our teaching hospitals around this country, if a resident or medical student doesn't order a test, they're more likely to be, doesn't order a test, they're more likely to be criticized than if they order an unnecessary test. So clearly, our educational system needs to evolve as we try to use our societal resources in healthcare as rationally and efficiently as possible.
And Betsy, how do you balance that need for innovation with the need, I'll just say, for common sense?
So it's interesting, Nancy. I think it's the younger generation that's really going to take us forward and change this culture towards wellness and prevention, because the introduction of digital mechanisms to really take care of yourself is really quite extraordinary. Jeff, in a minute, I'm sure, can expand on many of the things that we're doing around digital healthcare. But when you look at the power of a smartphone and its various apps to gain information, to monitor yourself, to monitor your behavior, I mean, it's really quite powerful. And again, it's a remarkable story that we can tell today that certainly didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. I think from a hospital perspective, it's really about engaging one's workforce. That I like to say that we can't take great care of patients unless we take great care of ourselves. And so it's really moving towards prevention and wellness programs for our employees, providing incentives, monetary and otherwise, and then really changing the culture so that prevention and wellness is part of any conversation that we have with a patient or a family, no matter what the setting might be. But I'm really looking for the digital advances to really take us there.
Well, this works out very well to the question that just came from the audience, and it's really applicable to anyone on this panel. Are companies and/or hospitals planning to share non-identifier patient disease genetics data? I mean, I'm one of those people who believes that if you can, you should get your genome done and put it in the stratosphere and donate it and let people just say, have at it. And the more we share, the bigger the pool is. Anybody's thoughts?
I completely agree. Right? Look, there's so much to do and so much information that we need to get. The more data you have, the more genomes you have, the better annotated they are, the more you know the natural history of the patient from whom that genome comes, the more useful it is to everybody. Those should be common resources. I agree completely.
So how far has HIPAA set us back? Oh boy, what a brave panel.
Well, it's interesting, and because the Institute of Medicine recently came out with a report encouraging open data sharing policies for clinical trial data. And that might be an interesting topic to hear my colleagues from the pharma and device company talk about. But the idea that sponsors of clinical trials, once they have published or registered with the FDA, should really make that data available in a HIPAA compliant manner so that we can aggregate data and build larger data sets by which to do analytics. You can take that one step further and say, really, isn't patient care data, doesn't that belong to the patient? It doesn't belong to the hospital or the doctor, it belongs to the patient. And if a patient wants, or an individual, if we as individuals want to share our medical information, genetic or otherwise, we should be in the position to do so.
I think it's really been an unintended consequence, Nancy, in many ways, because many of the early clinical trials that signed people up, and even many of the hospitals, didn't anticipate the era of genomics, and so patients weren't signed up for that. So if you have a trial that had 10,000 patients, none of whom were consented to share genetic information, you now have to go back and try to identify those 10,000 patients and reconsent them, and that has been a barrier, I think, to getting some of this information up. I think as we move forward, many companies are including that in their informed consent, and that'll make this an easier push up into the databases.
Yeah, and there's another layer on that, because even when patients started to get consented for genetic information, you didn't have permission to share it, right? And so it's only, I think, recently that the trials have been done in a way that the information could be shared. And in Europe, there's a mandate now to make clinical trial data public. There are legitimate proprietary issues in some of those clinical trials, and so they'll be redacted, right? But a lot of those data will become public now.
I think it goes far beyond genomic data. I think when I look at this whole system, and we were talking about efficiencies in the system, information technology probably holds more promise than anything else to provide new ideas, new solutions, data analytics coming from devices and hospital systems where we can put them together by the millions of patients, not by the thousands of patients. And I think that's going to really be a key to how we get efficiencies out of this system and make better medical decisions for patients. We'll actually improve care if we actually have a better integrated set of databases.
And so as CEOs, do you see yourselves developing drugs and new therapies and medical devices, along that paradigm?
I mean, I'll give you an example from our CF programs. We now provide many of our patients with Bluetooth spirometers that you can breathe into and measure your own FEV1, as Betsy said, right into your cell phone. That data is a day-to-day, minute-to-minute progress report for that patient. It's very useful real-world data for us about our medicines, right? Instead of going into a physician every 6 weeks and getting your FEV1 measured once, which may be indicative or not, we're actually getting daily multiple measurements, and we can follow thousands of data points in those patients over time. That's incredibly useful information for them and for us.
Yeah, I would say in the device side, these new solutions and leveraging IT capabilities are part of the portfolio roadmap for all of our divisions. You know, you could take cardiac rhythm implantable defibrillators that have all the sensors built in, but then the patient needs to go home, and how do you monitor that patient remotely? Their blood pressure, their weight, potentially various other parameters you can measure. And so we do that to help the patient, try to help the patient to have too many readmissions that aren't necessary, and turn that over useful information back to the physician to manage that patient remotely.
And I would just add that one of the major investments that we're making across partners under the leadership of Ann Klubansky is the creation of a biobank, giving patients an opportunity to give us consented samples that can be used for research in a very flexible way. Right now we have 25,000 consented samples. Our goal is to grow that dramatically in the coming years, and it's going to be a remarkable resource for our research community and help some of the collaborations that we hope to foster with industry as well.
And as you know, the telecommunications industry really sees itself as part of the healthcare industry. Every CEO I've spoken to of every telephone, data collecting, cable company sees itself as part of this entire thing. The smart home, opening up your refrigerator and you go to reach for something and you get a beep or a lock, or you know if your 88-year-old mother is walking, 18 times during one night. On what level, if we're really talking about collaboration between university, teaching centers, providers, pharma, biotech, do you also collaborate to others outside your fields?
For sure.
Absolutely, Nancy. It's interesting. I think that for Peter and I, we probably have a couple dozen young physicians who are working for Google Ventures, for example, and helping to integrate some of the Google projects around healthcare into the provider community. I mean, it's extraordinarily exciting.
One of the great things about Boston, we have this community of academic medical centers, biotech companies, and now tech companies all working together on these problems. I really think it's one of our competitive advantages.
And you touched on something earlier about the fact that we spend so much money so late, in life. The ability to keep people in their homes comfortable but monitored. It's not, is it going to happen? You can do it now.
It is.
Yeah, you can do it now, right? And I mean, for example, we have a collaboration with Google, right? Where we're putting devices on a couple thousand MS patients to monitor them 24/7, right? And it's tied to a smartphone, a Google phone, not surprisingly. And we'll be able to gather data on them continuously, the kinds of motion, how far they go, their heart rate, temperature. And so that kind of data, which is real-time data, is so much better than the punctate data that you get if the patient comes in to see a physician every few months and gets some series of tests run. Has to be validated through the clinical trials, but that certainly is the future. If you use this to try and modify behavior, it's interesting, right? Because if an app buzzes when it's time to take a pill or gives you a negative feedback when you reach for a donut, people turn it off, right? It's still the same psychology that's at work there. The positive reinforcement seems to work better, right? If you take your hand away from the donut, you see a picture of your grandkids. Then that seems to work better, right?
But we want to build upon that to really empower us as individuals to take responsibility for our care. So while at Partners we're investing in a very intricate electronic medical record, we would love for our patients to be able to take the data that they are accumulating on their Apple Watch or whatever device and download it into their medical record. So eventually you'll have your medical record, you probably will have it on your watch or your smartphone, be able to integrate data from various inputs. And you'll be able to monitor but also think about the information that you can provide a healthcare provider when you need
It's
to.
the ultimate power. The patient
It is.
has control of his or her
Exactly,
data,
that's right.
and yet shares this is somewhere in the biosphere, you know, in a collaborative way.
So, CF is the disease of kids and teenagers. So we're actually working with them to build game systems where they can measure their activity, which we want to increase, and compare it to their friends' activity. And those game systems and the positive feedback that they get from those turn out to be very, very powerful motivators for these.
George, I'm going back to you for a second because this is a conference devoted to neurology, neurodegenerative diseases, and what's on the frontier. You have an exciting drug at Biogen that people are really talking about for Alzheimer's. But talk to me a little bit about why it's promising, and then with the Sovaldi message that the way we kicked off this panel, how you're going to shepherd this.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, let me say it's a drug candidate, so it's been through some early trials, but we have a long way to go. And in those early trials, look, we did a clinical trial of about 160 patients. We had a placebo group and 4 different dose groups, and we're following those patients for 18 months. Right? Every patient, these are early, very mild Alzheimer's patients, every patient was screened with PET imaging before they came into the trial, so we know they all had amyloid deposition in their brains. This is an antibody against beta amyloid, which is the protein that's found in those plaques. And so what we found was a dose and time dependent reduction in the level of amyloid, beta amyloid deposits in the brains of those patients. And at the 1-year time point, we had a statistically significant and dose-dependent slowing of the rate of cognitive decline, so improvement relative to placebo. Okay? So that's pretty exciting. The error bars are small, data was clean, lines are straight from different time points, so it all looks like it's hanging together. So that's 160 patients. Now, it's not a huge patient sample, but based on that, we are gearing up for 2 large phase 3 trials, which will be probably between them 2,800 patients. We are probably going to build a new manufacturing plant, so in the case that it's positive, we'll be able to make the drug and supply it. So if you think about all that, it's probably a $2.5 billion investment to make on this, which I think gets to some of the issues we've been talking about before we know if that drug really works or not. It's certainly promising and encouraging and has generated some excitement, and rightfully so, but we still have to prove that it works. It's an IV drug, right? So if it does work and it is approved, then you know, how many millions of patients can get an IV drug, you know, once a month? So we need to work on a sub-Q formulation. We need to work on better imaging technology. So PET's expensive, and not everybody has access to PET scanning. So hopefully we or someone will be able to develop cheaper, more convenient, more reliable diagnostic tests as well.
Peter, you were going to say something.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's no more important disease from a societal standpoint to tackle than Alzheimer's disease. The federal funding through the NIH for research on it is woefully inadequate, and it's these kind of signals that make us all so excited about the future. So developing drugs for Alzheimer's, there's probably nothing that we as an industry could do to have more of an impact on society in the coming decades than develop an effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. We now have about 45 million Americans over the age of 65, on the way up to 60 or 70 or maybe even higher over the next couple of decades. So this disease is going to take a huge toll on our society unless we come up with better ways to prevent it and treat it.
So it always raises then the question, is there enough money in the bank, literally the societal bank, to treat this disease? And is this the case of early drug development, early detection, lifestyle stuff, as much prevention versus throwing a lot of money at the end, i.e. the analogy of late life? Betsy?
I think that's exactly the direction in which we need to go. The story that Jeff told earlier about cardiovascular disease is a wonderful success story about how we have pushed age-related morbidity and mortality for cardiovascular disease out multiple decades due to prevention measures as well as advances in surgical therapies and devices. And we simply need to have that same success now with the neurosciences and the neurological disorders. Nancy, there's one area of collaboration that we haven't talked about, and I think it ties into what Peter was discussing about the downward pressure on the NIH budget.
I was just going to bring that up.
Well,
good timing.
The effect that it has for Peter and I leading academic medical centers is we obviously need to be thinking about how we maintain biomedical research, and particularly the training of the next generation of research scientists. As you all know, historically, we have depended upon the NIH for training grants and other funding support to train physicians, physician scientists, PhD scientists, who really then go out and populate the pharma, biotech, device world. And there's sort of been this wonderful cross-subsidization that's occurred for a very long period of time under our fee-for-service system. We've been able to use our clinical margin to support our research and education, which then really fuels the biomedical research industry in this country. And I think we'd all agree we've been pretty successful in this country. But that downward pressure is something that Peter and I struggle with, because we both are very committed to the fact that we will continue to train the next generation of physician scientists and medical leaders in this country. But I think this is an area where we now have to have a more collaborative conversation with our pharma and device colleagues.
Because
about
you're
how
not,
we do that.
neither you nor Peter are looking to the federal government to up the ante and invest more money.
Well, we're going to continue to put pressure on the federal government to up the ante, but we've got to be looking for Plan B as well.
And Plan B is sitting around you.
We hope.
And it already is.
Never been called Plan B before.
How much do you need?
Wow.
But the consequences of this slowing of the rise in the NIH budget is huge. The spending power of the NIH is now comparable to what it was in the year 2000, well before the doubling. We are slowing the rate of progress we're making on diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer, mental illness as a result of it. I think general perspective is it's the rate-limiting step in developing effective treatments or insights into these diseases. There's not the ideas, it is the money. And we are also discouraging a whole generation of young Americans from going into biomedical research. It wasn't so long ago that if you submitted a grant to the NIH, about 1 in 3 of them got funded. Now it's 1 in 10, and young people can't see, it's just too steep a hill to climb for people to pursue those careers. So I think we're losing a generation of very talented Americans that might have gone into this field and giving the field away to other countries that would be happy to take our leadership position in medical research from us.
Yeah, this is not just an issue for the academic medical centers. This is an issue for all of us, right? Why is Boston and Cambridge have such a vibrant biotech community? It's because of the academic centers around here, and because of the amazing population here of scientists that can populate not only the great academic institutions, but also companies. If that whole enterprise gets threatened, it's an ecosystem, and it doesn't just impact the 2 hospitals here. It impacts Jeff, and it impacts me, and it impacts all of the small biotech companies here. So this is a serious issue.
The irony is that the science and the opportunity has never been better, and the funding for this has never been worse. And so we're in this situation where a piece of the ecosystem is being chipped away at exactly the time when the science has more opportunity to produce
So how
more
do you
cures
fix
than ever.
that?
I think one is we tell our story better. I spent a lot of time down in Washington talking with politicians about this ecosystem,
Do they
why
get
this
it?
is so important. Some do, not all. But I think we as a community have to do that, and rather than pointing fingers at each other and saying, you should reduce this, or we need to come together as a community and understand what we do and tell that story to the public and to politicians. It's actually a great story, we just haven't told it.
Mike, if you look at cardiovascular health, it really is a system that people understand. People understand vascular disease, they understand hearts, they understand strokes pretty darn well. The brain, you could argue, is the last great frontier. And there are lessons to be learned from what we've talked about with cardiovascular disease. What would your advice be to a young scientist or a young company, a young neuro company that sees an avenue and wants to replicate the kind of success that your company's had?
tell them to partner with Raphael, our head of R&D. He's here. No, I would say just in the neuro area, it's so exciting. We have a growing neuromodulation division that focuses on severe pain and Parkinson's and hopefully in the future Alzheimer's, and lots of capabilities and technologies moving that way. But it's so early versus cardiovascular. And it's where we spend our highest percent of R&D. It's where they're meeting with Google and all the various companies for venture. But in terms of smaller companies, I do think partnering with a large medical device company who has capability in the devices, so we can contribute IP in that area. So the small startup doesn't get focused on trying to create the next miniaturized device. They can focus more on the therapy. So I think partnering with companies who have certain capabilities is really critical. And that way they can focus on their clinical trials and the therapy rather than trying to replicate the microelectronics and visualization, all the capabilities that we have. So I do think partnering with large companies is important. But this field, you say the last frontier, when we talk about the capabilities that our team is developing as a few of our competitors, our hope is that we become a bit of a competitor to the drug companies, and that our devices are more of a one-time fix and treatment for patients.
I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this panel sort of looping back to how we started, that the road to advancement is collaborative, not disruptive. And yet I would charge that each of you has to be internally disruptive, or you won't keep growing and innovating and getting better and better. So down the line, I'm going to start with you, Jeff. How do you guys, especially with cystic fibrosis, transformed within our lifetimes, self-disrupt?
That's a great question. People ask me what keeps me up at night with respect to my job at Vertex, and I always tell them the same thing. It's how do we keep this culture of innovation vibrant as we get bigger and more successful? It's harder to do. When you're young and small and hungry as a company, everybody's up all night worrying about that. When you get bigger, more successful, people start to get complacent, and we can't be complacent. What we try to do at Vertex is to keep people incredibly excited and connected to the patients. So we have CF patients coming in to Vertex and their families all the time. We today can treat about 15% of all patients. Our next drug, we hope will get approved this summer, that can treat 50%. But there's still going to be 40% of patients out there that don't have a treatment or a cure. We think we know how to get there, but we bring those patients in all the time to remind ourselves of what we're doing and why we're coming to work every day. And that's how we stay fresh and disruptive, if you will, to get the next innovation.
Mike, how do you disrupt?
Well, a lot of the concept you just said, our theme is advancing science for life. So we have patient stories literally every day. And that's ultimately what motivates our employees more than the stock price, is how you impact patients. So that has to be foundation. And then we think of a lot of things. One, we set tough metrics that are competitive. We try to keep our team smaller and focused. We look at disruptive early venture deals that we bring in that may sacrifice the core R&D spend of our core business. And so between connecting to the patient, tough metrics, small teams, and being very aggressive in terms of our external scanning, hopefully you drive a more innovative culture.
Betsy?
I'd like to say we disrupt with our young people. We
Or
want to.
they don't disrupt you?
They do, which is great. It's how we stay young. I'd like to think that we continue to attract the brightest and the best, who will go on to be outstanding physician scientists and medical leaders, that they will be the disruptors, that we provide the environment, the ecosystem, where they can take their talent and ideas and to continue to disrupt. It means we continually do things new, like setting up innovation hubs and translation accelerators and shark tanks, and encouraging them to develop apps for various purposes, and really just creating a culture where we say we're open for business.
George?
Well, since I'm fourth, I had some time to think about this, right? So look, I can answer it in a couple different ways, right? I mean, we focus on patients, we focus on our people, we focus on the culture, right? But we also focus on what patients need. And if you take MS as an example, 20 years ago, there was nothing to treat MS. Now there are 10 approved therapies. There are more in the clinic. But they all downregulate the immune response. None of them gets to the fundamental issue of MS. So does the world need more disease-modifying therapies that downregulate the immune response? No, probably not. Right? What we need is a way to repair the damage and to actually be neuroprotective and neuroregenerative. So in MS, that's what we're focusing on now. Right? And so then we focus on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and ALS. So once we get through all of those things, then we can think about how next to be disruptive.
So Peter, you get to bat
Yeah,
cleanup.
so I've had the privilege of hearing four of speakers precede me. For more than 200 years, I mean, we at MGH have been trying to do two things simultaneously: take great care of the patients we see every day, and at the same time innovate in the biologic sciences to come up with better answers for their care in the future. I think what we need to do, and we are working actively on this, is divert some of that innovative capacity toward the way that healthcare is delivered in the future, so that we can ensure that healthcare is affordable for our people of this country, and so that we can afford all these wonderful new biologic innovations that
And
we're
for our
gonna
children
be
and our
seeing.
children's children.
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank my extraordinary panelists. I'd like to thank you guys for sending in your questions, and Jorn for the technology to pull this all off. Thanks, everybody.